So our hour starts right now. So you guys made it through day one. You went to the zoo. You got up early. You came back. You made it through almost all of day two. Everybody staying late for the workshop tonight? Awesome. Yeah, I'll be here. The DSC workshop looks really good. So I'm really looking forward to it. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Michael Greene. The session and the topic is DSC for Azure Automation. I have a session tomorrow as well on DSC as the platform for DSC, and tomorrow I'm actually going to walk through and demo the new native code LCM that we've been working on. So for questions about native LCM, I'm happy to answer them now, but if you're looking for the full coverage of what we're doing with that project and the open sourcing of DSC, things like that, we'll get into a little bit more depth on that tomorrow. For today, the focus is going to be what are the cloud services that are available for DSC, and we're actually going to cover a lot of cloud services. I've got only a few slides. Most of this session is going to be demo, and we're going to walk through a lot of the scenarios that I'm seeing customers use as they're using DSC in hybrid cloud environments. So to introduce myself, I'm the program manager for DSC. I've been with Microsoft almost 14 years. The last year I've been with the PowerShell team. Before that I was with the CAT team and worked extensively with customers who were using DSC. Prior to that I worked in Office, and before that I was in the field, so I've been around the company all over. And I was one of the early contributors to DSC resources, and still active in contributing to the community modules and configurations and helping out with that. So I borrowed this slide from Jeffrey's session, and you probably saw it yesterday where he says the cloud, everybody originally used to say that the cloud changes everything, and then he switches over and says, no, really it's digital transformation that changes everything, and he uses the animation here. I'm actually going to rewind to this one and stick here for a second. There's a couple things that I want to get out of the way, almost like housekeeping. So let me pull up a couple of things here. Let's start by talking about using DSC in the cloud versus using DSC in an isolated on-premises network, and what the difference is, and what our plans are in this area and things like that. So if you're not deeply familiar with DSC, it's desired state configuration, and tomorrow we'll get a bit more into the nature of DSC and get, set, and test, but you can think about it as the configuration management platform, and not configuration management in the way that you would think about something like SCCM, where it's a tool for a centralized operations organization. This is for infrastructure as code or configuration as code, where you're releasing all changes to production from source control through a test pipeline where everything is validated before it reaches production, and you can do small batch changes very frequently following traditional CI/CD processes. And the goal really is to have living documentation and be able to reach production with very low risk of causing an outage. That's ultimately the goal. As part of the architecture for DSC, when we originally introduced DSC, we had what was known as push and pull, and we're still pretty much adhering to push and pull. Push being that from some machine, you're going to be delivering that configuration to another node. Could be from your workstation that you're just going to remotely target another system. It could be as part of a build pipeline that you have a build agent or a release management service that's going to be pushing to another node. And then pull is where you're taking that configuration as code, putting it somewhere that a bunch of nodes can access, and just registering the nodes to that service. So you can think about it as the last mile, what we'd say in the US, the last kilometer perhaps, but the point where all of the servers are able to reach to a common location and pull down what they need based on being registered and given a role name, and they can get all of the assets that are required to help them converge into the right configuration. So in order to deliver that, whenever DSC was first introduced, there's a capability that was put into Windows Server 2012 R2 called Windows Pull Server. And of course it shipped again in 2016. It'll ship again in 2019. I'm putting up a blog post tomorrow, but I'm going to show it to you guys today. So this is scheduled to go live at 2 a.m. Pacific time, which is 9 a.m. here, right before, 45 minutes before my session tomorrow. Just to give an update, so I put up a blog post this past January on our planning updates for DSC, and I said I would commit to commenting about Windows Pull Server as well. And that's something I want to keep doing, is like every 6 months, just do a planning update. And as we take DSC open source, then you'll be able to see progress that we're making a lot more transparently. But I still think it's a good idea just to have a regular cadence where we're formally saying this is the directions we're headed. But a couple things for Windows Pull Server. Let me make that text much bigger. We can live with that. The first is the current Windows Insiders program release, which you can go, I've got the link on here, but you can search for Windows Server Insiders. It's part of the Windows Insiders program, where you can download builds of Windows Server before they're publicly available. In the current Windows Insiders release, it includes the binaries to get SQL Server supports as the backend database for Windows Pull Server. So when Windows Pull Server was first created, it supported MDB and eCent databases came along later, but we've had a lot of issues getting Pull Server database to scale and have performance based on what we had hoped to deliver. So there's two parts that have to come out. One is this change in Windows Server, and the other is we've merged the changes already to the XDSC web service resource that is part of the XPS desired state configuration module, and that introduced new properties. One is, I think, is SQL Server, and then SQL Server connection string, I think is the second one. And the documentation's already been updated, and the changes have already been merged, so you can get this Server Insiders release and start playing with this. And really what this gives us, I've tested standing up multiple pull servers as the front end, and load balancing across those and pointing them at, really all it's looking for is a SQL instance. So it could be a standalone SQL box, it could be SQL Express on the local box, it can be a SQL cluster. I haven't tested it against SQL Azure, but in theory that would work because it's just a connection string. But load balancing worked great, so high availability should be fine. I don't know, I don't have enough data yet to feel comfortable saying X number of nodes is the top end. I just need to see it like realistically perform in customer environments before I'm comfortable putting a label on it. I could say, yeah, sir, go ahead. Great question. I should have mentioned that already, so I'm glad you reminded me. It's only in 2016, and since it's released for current branch, then it goes into the current branch releases, which are actually server core only. We are planning to also include it in a full branch, like a long-term servicing branch installation. I don't know what the timeline will be for that yet, but the first time that you'll see it as a fully supported release will be the next current branch release that follows this Insiders track. So. A timeline? I don't know what the timeline is for the next current branch release. Yeah, I don't want to make something up. So, yeah, that'll be the next release, and you can test it now, kind of get a feel for how it's going to work in your environment. Yeah, that'll give us high availability. And then the bigger thing that I think a lot of people have been looking forward to is the ecosystem of SQL reporting. So then you can point Power BI. I've looked at the table structure. It's pretty simple. And you can really do a lot with reporting out of that SQL data. So the other thing that I'm very clear about in this blog post, so support for the Windows Server pull service, it follows the Windows Server release cycle, right? So that's 10 years in extended support, and it'll ship in 2019, probably after that. So support for Windows Pull Server isn't going anywhere, but I'm also being very, very transparent and saying we don't have plans for more features for Pull Server. So although it's not going anywhere, I don't want people to have expectations that we're planning on introducing a bunch of new capabilities. Right now, we don't have anything that we're planning to do other than adding support for SQL Server. Most of our investments in this set of technologies are going into the Azure capabilities. The next question would be, so what's it look like to have a hybrid environment, and are we thinking about taking this into an isolated environment? And there's been a lot of speculation whether we would put Azure Automation into Azure Stack. We could, but we haven't had a bunch of customers like really giving us strong feedback that that's what we need to do. So for now, the plan is to keep just working through hybrid scenarios where it's very similar to what Jeffrey talked about with digital transformation, where running that server isn't a core priority for most organizations. So if it can run as a service that they can take advantage of and certainly make it part of cloud architectures, then we'll stick with that model for now. And then in the future, if it looks like we need to take a step back and look further at isolated scenarios, we will. But my recommendation I put in the bottom of this article, if you really strongly require isolated environments, and we've got a ton of customers, especially in government space, that have requirements for isolated environments. One thing I would do is look at push scenarios supported by Pull Server. The biggest downfall of Pull Server right now is it doesn't handle certificate management automatically, and I'll talk about what that means in a couple slides. But that's the biggest downfall. If you saw the DSC security session over lunch, he went through what does it take to encrypt the inside of a moth file whenever you're using a Pull Server. And so that certificate management is handled automatically in the cloud service, but it's very DIY. There's a lot of stuff that's very DIY, frankly, about Pull Server right now. But you could overcome some of that by using push to deliver your configuration, but then having the Pull Server deliver your modules and use it for reporting. So I think we need to document that scenario really well, and we'll do that, and kind of make that the go-to scenario for Pull Server, and then also document how to get a better handle on the security aspects of it. And then Ben Gallens, who's an MVP, it has actually written a lot of the automation to make Pull Server behave like Azure Automation and do certificate handling and things like that. So he is looking at creating a GitHub repo for extensions to Pull Server. We probably won't open source Windows Pull Server itself. Getting that code out of Windows and into GitHub would take like moving a mountain type of work. But we've documented the protocol, and there's multiple open source projects now that have implemented it, Tug and Trek. And if he can maintain a repo of extensions that are open source for Pull Server, then that's actually something that we could contribute to and assist the community in delivering more features that way. And honestly, what I have in mind and my intention is to take as much of DSC open source as possible, and that seems like the path of least resistance around that. So I'm not making a bunch of engineering commitments to those extensions right now, but I think as customers come along and say we have additional requirements for isolation, then that would be a good way for us to compromise in that scenario. So let me switch back over. So the cloud does change some things. This is my only marketing slide, and it's not really a marketing slide, it's more like an EBC briefing slide. And I have not found a better way to represent this information than in that circle. We've tried like an infinity symbol and other methods, and what it's really trying to say, if you think about 10 years ago, how did we describe the application lifecycle? And it would have been a picture of a pipe or a timeline or something to represent the beginning and the end and things happening in the middle. And that was just how we thought about application lifecycles. There's the process of building it and testing it and releasing it and then supporting it and then retiring it. And that was the timeline of an application lifecycle. And in the market as it stands now, those things don't happen at the beginning and the end anymore. They need to happen throughout the entire process. So I'll give you an example. This session, we're going to cover Azure Automation, but we're not going to talk too much about runbooks. But I'm a big believer in, as an application developer, don't just develop your application and then hand it over to operations and say, oh, hey, every 90 days, rotate those service account passwords. Right. Yeah, thanks. We'll just develop, processes around that. Thanks for just handing this off to us. Instead, as part of your architecture for the application, and I'll show you what this would look like in like an ARM template for Azure, define the transactions that need to happen in operations. Maybe you've got a script that automatically will rotate service account passwords or change out certificates or whatever's required, like once a year or every 90 days, something needs to happen in the application. Embed that in the project so that as it gets handed off to operations, operations can also scale effectively because automation was designed as part of the application. And the same is true for every aspect of the operational lifecycle. They all need to happen from the very beginning of the application and be tested as part of the application all the way through the next release and releases after that. And the same is true for one of the big areas that our team is investing in is governance. So what are the requirements for your organization, and how can you check that inside these VMs, as you're scaling out and handing off more and more things to operations, that you can validate that you're in compliance and then incorporate that into your test lifecycle, so that as developers are trying and testing things out, they'll know during that test cycle whether or not they're in compliance or not, instead of finding that out 90 days after they've released to production and then somebody says, oh, we have to pass an audit, and it's like an afterthought. So all of these things need to be happening in real time throughout the entire process. For Azure Automation DSC and the individual features it provides, this is actually the list that I would describe as things that it provides in addition to what Windows Pull Server provided. So if you think about Windows Pull Server as providing the pull service protocol, it was an implementation of saying you can register your nodes to this service and it will be able to pull down a configuration, pull down modules, and receive reporting data. Azure Automation DSC has actually had for a while now growth in addition and beyond that feature set. So it is a cloud service. It doesn't run on-prem currently. All of the data to and from is encrypted while it's in transit, and then it's encrypted while it's at rest in the service. So there's no way to access that data directly. It's encrypted as part of the service, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. All the clients, oh, by the way, I should mention as part of that, we do publish the Azure Data Center whitelists. So this is kind of an interesting discussion that I've gotten into a couple of times, but people will say, oh, well, we're not going to let our servers talk to the internet. Well, the servers aren't talking to the internet in the broad sense of the entire internet, right? They don't need to go shopping on, they don't need to order eggs from the grocery store and things like that. You can whitelist at the router and say, the servers can talk to these other data centers. The same way if you were working with a colo, or if you had multiple data centers and you have a connection between data centers and you're encrypting traffic, the same thing is happening here. You're saying, not traffic to the internet. Oh, I appear to have lost my connection to my battery. There, we're back. I'll just have to keep an eye on that. It's not broad traffic to the entire internet, so we publish that IP range, but this is a huge conversation to have with the security team. They're instantly going to say, oh, that's traffic leaving our data center, and it's talking to servers directly, and we're not okay with that. So it takes a lot of patience to sit down and say, okay, we get it, it's traffic leaving the data center, and you need to be able to scan it at the layer 7 level and things like that. And we are looking at how we can incorporate proxy-based connections so that you can use traffic analyzers and things like that as part of this system. But whenever somebody says, oh, we're not allowing traffic to and from the internet, be quick to say, it's not going to and from the internet, it's going to Microsoft's data centers, and we can whitelist just that traffic, and then we can, everything's happening over SSL in the same way we've trusted encrypted traffic for years. The client certificates are managed completely automatically, which means you can just publish your configuration over SSL to the service. They're stored safely there. A certificate lands on the nodes that are being managed. That SSL is used to deliver private data to the machine, and then the certificate is used to encrypt the data while it's at rest on the machine as well. So the entire process, the data, even though it's just information about how the machine is being managed, the entire process, the data is encrypted. One of the things that's cool about Azure Automation that we kind of got for free, so that the service obviously originally provided orchestration. Because of that, it had a way to store environment variables and certificates and encrypt credentials and store secrets and store connection strings and things like that. So we kind of get all that for free, which means as you're authoring a configuration and you're going to hand it off to the service, you can just include, if you've got like a static reference that you want to be able to use over and over again, but you don't necessarily want to embed it in your authoring process, you could just call those variables as part of your configuration and retrieve them from the service. The only thing I'm going to touch on before we switch over is you can manage the LCM configuration centrally, both from PowerShell and from the portal. And when I say LCM configuration, there's settings you're going to care about, like is it okay for this machine to reboot automatically, or does that need to be scheduled? Do I want this machine to apply changes and then just monitor for drift? Or do I want it to apply the configuration, and then if it drifts, I want it to automatically bring itself back? And that really depends on what your configuration is for that server role, and whether or not it requires a reboot, and what it looks like if it needs to self-heal. So it kind of have to depend on that per role. And the only thing I'll mention, we haven't documented this yet, canary groups. You can actually define in the service that you want machines to be divided up into groups, and then you can do releases as node assignments to those groups directly. So you don't have to say, as soon as I release this configuration, it's going to hit all of my machines at once. If you want to say 10%, 20%, 30%, 70%, 100%, and be conservative about how you release change, that's actually a feature of the service now that's only available through the commandlets right now. So the rest of this session is going to be demo. If there's anything that you don't see on here that you would like to see me walk through, then I'm happy to add it. We can kind of treat this like a piano man situation where people can just call out demos, and I'm happy to walk through it. But I'm going to refer back to this as we go, but this is what we're going to talk about. Let's first take a look at Azure Automation and what it is, and we're going to start off just by importing a configuration and modules. First, we're going to find the mouse cursor and switch over to duplicate. So when you get to the Azure Portal and you deploy a new resource group, you create an automation account, this is what you'll see whenever it's a new automation account. And I've got a couple of automation accounts here, some with machines that are already registered so we can move quickly, and then this one's empty. So the first thing that you're going to want to look at, if you're familiar with DSC, you're familiar with PowerShellGallery.com. That's where the community is publishing DSC resources. And if you go into modules, you'll find that there's global modules that exist here. And I've got a couple at the bottom that I've imported, but like the ARM commandlets are available, etc. If I go to Browse Gallery, let's do xweb admin and do search, and you'll find I can bring in the DSC modules that the gallery has published, or that the community has written and published to the gallery directly from here. Let's also do x pending reboot and import that. You can do this from the commandlets. Let me switch over here. All of the commandlets for Azure Automation are available for PowerShell Core now as part of the Azure RM.NET Core installation, or you can install just Azure RM.Automation.NET Core from the gallery. You can do most things from here, from the commandlets, but the one thing, there's a couple of things I want to call out that you can't. So here's import. You can import modules to the service from the commandlets. You can import configurations into the service from the commandlets, and I'll show you some GitHub repos with examples of how to automate the entire process. There's not a built-in way right now to have the commandlets pull the modules from the gallery into the service. The way that I typically automate that is I go look at the gallery, and you kind of have to get tricky and figure out what the URL is to the NuGet package that the gallery maintains in Azure Blob Storage for those gallery items, and then you can put it in your automation scripts to pull them across automatically. Or you can just have a script that, and the right way to do this would be to find a community module that does what you want it to do, something like manage IIS in this case. Bring that to your machine, look at the contents, make sure that there's nothing malicious happening inside that could be a threat or a risk to your environment, and then publish that to your own NuGet environment or blob storage or wherever you would like to keep it, and then incorporate that into your automation. But if this is a test environment and you just want to get started, opening the browser and importing it from the gallery is a perfectly good way to just move fast and create a quick test environment. Similarly, so by the way, right now, and we're looking at cleaning this up, but we treat all modules the same in the service. So whether it's a PowerShell module or an Azure Automation module, or sorry, a DSC resource module, we treat them all the same. They all show up under modules. And then if you go in and look at the activities as they extract, you would actually see the individual resources as activities instead of function names. So if I scroll up, similarly, if I look at DSC configurations, you can see I've got one for domain controller here now. This is a fairly new feature. If you go out and browse the gallery, this is searching PowerShell Gallery with two requirements. One is that it's a script. The other is that it has a tag DSC configuration. So this is taking an entire configuration example and pulling it in. Sometimes you'll also find inside modules that there's examples, but they tend to be demonstrating what the module was intended to provide, whereas these scripts are an end-to-end scenario. You'll also find that the author for all of these is me, because I'm just trying to seed the gallery and get some things going, and then the community can provide more. So let's pick NetCore Windows Server Config, and you'll be able to see, just like for modules, you can see exactly what it is. You can see that it requires those two modules that we imported. It's going to install Windows Feature Web Server. It's going to go get the .NET Core package and install it on the machine, set environment variables. It's going to handle rebooting the node automatically, and then it's going to create a website and make sure that the logs go to the correct places. And then you can actually do a lot with web administration. So if you wanted to define more information about what port the site should run on, things like that, you can. The point is, if you are looking at working with developers in your organization, and they say, what we really need is some way that we can get all the dependencies for our application. Like we've got a new .NET Core application, and we just need some way to put our dependencies inside of VMs and make sure that they're always there. That's the intention here, is to meet those application dependencies. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we show some of the private preview features. Okay, so that has imported. Now, if you've been using DSC, then you've seen on your machine. Yeah, there's a question?
I was wondering if there is any class to support composite configurations in Azure Automation?
There is support for composite configurations. Actually, let's boil that down. So we do support class-based resources. I haven't tested class resources inside of composites, but I don't know why it wouldn't work. It should work. I can follow up on that and tweet about it. The other question that comes up a lot is partial configurations. So do we support partial configurations for the service? And the answer is we do, but we only support one partial configuration per automation account. So you would have to have multiple accounts if you've got a division across partial configurations. But I actually have a document pending that I'm still finishing up. We've had really strong feedback from the community that composite resources are a much better solution than partial configurations. So in the document, I go through why that is and explain everything. So, but yeah, we do support composites. If you've authored configurations on your local machine, you've seen that you author it using the script and then you compile it. So here I've got the configuration. I can go in and view the configuration source. I can't make changes. We're looking at whether or not we should do that. But you'll see you can compile the configuration here in the service, and then I'll let that compile and switch over and just look at nodes. You can see as I switched there that it was listed as a configuration. So you can add nodes and register them with the service. It's super easy to pull in nodes from Azure, obviously. You can just click Add Azure VM, you select it from the list, and it actually bootstraps it using the DSC extension, and we'll talk about that. You can also, if you click on Add Non-Azure Node, then you can register nodes that are on-prem. let's talk about pricing real quick before we move on. So this service for Azure nodes, there's no additional charge. You can just use this, incorporate it in your design, no additional charge for using this for managing machines that are on Azure. If it's an on-prem machine, then the pricing actually gets a little bit tricky, and here's why. If you're using it as part of all of the services that are available, so if you were also using update management and you were doing change tracking and inventory and using all the services, then this would be part of the suite, which runs about $6 per node per month. If you're only using this service, then you can factor the price based on how often the nodes connect to the service. And I've got this documented in a blog post, but you can get this down in like the 25-cent per node per month range. And what's actually happening there is you're configuring local configuration manager and how often it's going to check in with the service. So if you've got really high priority nodes and you need to know that they are compliant every 15 minutes, which is what it would do by default, then it's going to be $6 a month. If you're fine with just once a day or every couple of days, this server should check in and just let us know that it's still compliant because it's a file server at a remote site, and nothing's going to fall over if 15 minutes go by and it's not compliant. Then that's fine. You can use that as a tool to drive the price down. Now, of course, it changes the management model, because if you want to publish a configuration change, it could be 24 hours before the node checks in with the pull server to get it. But again, for a lot of scenarios, customers are finding that's fine. So it's just something to think about as you're thinking about how you would design this into a project. So if I go back and click on the server, I just want to show really quickly that you can assign the configuration here. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. Basically, it would pull up the node details. You can click Assign Node Configuration, and that configuration that we just compiled, you can assign to the node, and at that point, you can also apply the additional settings, like should it apply an autocorrect, at what frequency should it check for changes, things like that. Let's take a look at, not skipping over anything. Oh, good. Let's talk about comparison to extension. And I'll try that request again. I'm in the process of going through the Azure Quick Start templates in GitHub and updating all of the ones that use extension to start using what we're calling the default configuration script. So let's take a look at some examples. This repo, it's really hard to see. This might help some. This repo was published several years ago by Joe Levy, one of the previous PMs for DSC. And you see that update LCM for Azure Automation pull. So the way this was being used is there's such a thing as an extension in Azure for virtual machines. And the extension is used whenever you want to interact directly with something happening inside that VM. And you can actually use the DSC extension in a standalone way to do push to an Azure VM. So you would say, I'm going to take my configuration and my modules, I'm going to zip them up, I'm going to put that into a blob storage, and then I'm just going to, in my project, refer the VM to that location. It'll pull it in, run the configuration scripts, compile them off, and apply it to the machine. So you can use that as a push scenario. That zip file, you would use it exactly the same way, but once it gets pulled in, you would just provide the parameters that say, here's the URL and my private key for the Azure Automation service, and you would just use it for a bootstrap model. That is no longer required. So we are now taking that exact zip file and including it in the extension payload. So as that extension gets installed inside the VM, that script is already there. If you don't tell it a module and configuration name and you leave that blank, then it assumes you want to call that one, and then the inbound parameters would just be the same. We are fixing an issue right now, so I've got an example out here of how to do this. Here's a project template, and if I go into my nested projects, there's two things. One is I would use an Azure Deployment template to actually provision the account put the configuration there, just like what we showed a second ago using the portal, put the modules there, and compile it. So what that actually looks like, so here I've got the actual automation account. I'm pulling in an X Active Directory, an X storage resource. I'm accepting parameters into this project that would then create credentials that I'm going to use as a local admin on the machine, and it's storing that in the service so that it can get pulled into the configuration at compile time. Same for safe mode. And then you also provide, skipped over the configuration. There's the actual configuration and the URL here where it's going to come from. And then you also provide in that project a compilation job. Something to be aware of, the compilation job resource is actually not idempotent. So the only time that you'll really run into that is if you're using the copy method and telling it to reprovision, like here's a VM, now reprovision it 12 times, give me 12 of them. And if it has a depends on relationship to that job being compiled, when it goes back, it would actually say, oh, I've already compiled this job, and then it'll throw an error. So the way around that is to have it depend on other aspects besides the compile name until we make a change here. But you can actually define here a unique name, and in this case, it is, further up in the variables, it creates a GUID for the name of the compile job. And then if I go back, so that would create the account, put the configuration in it, put the modules in it, compile the configuration. Now if I go look at the server, scroll way down. So this is creating the network, etc. So this is creating the VM. It's going to go deploy Server 2016 core, connect it to a network, etc. And then you have a VM extension, and it's the type DSC. And the way that this is working right now is a little bit ugly, where I've got a fairly large block of JSON that says, here's my URL, I've got parameters around configuration name, whether the node should automatically reboot, etc. So we actually have two different schemas for the extension. This is the older extension. Now that we've added the new extension, we just have to have the service support it, but this will actually get down to about 4 lines of JSON once that change is complete. So I'll update this template at that time, and we'll update the documentation as well. But the documentation actually does a good job now of referencing how this works. So in your deployment template, you can put all of your project requirements. I need an automation account, I need to be able to configure machines, here's all my requirements to make that happen. And as I'm deploying VMs, I want to bootstrap them into that service and manage them. The other thing that I would mention as far as comparison between the service and the extension, and if you're thinking about this as an architect and you want to justify one method over the other, whenever you're using that push scenario specifically with extension, that extension runs during deployment. You can set it to apply an autocorrect, but it's going to be there during deployment time doing the work. Whenever you're putting your configuration in the service and then registering your node to the service, what you're really saying is, I care about the long-term aspects of this machine. So I'm going to register this node to a service that maintains that the management state, and then I can go look at the reporting and see exactly what state the machine is in and whether it's compliant. I can get diagnostic information from the service. So it's a long-term view of how I'm going to manage that machine versus just applying a configuration during deployment. So let's skip down and look at these next two. How are we doing on time? Okay, perfect. Yeah, let's skip down to these two, and then I'm going to come back to change tracking and inventory. So the next one would be, how do I look at this together with log analytics? And then we'll take a look at a feature that's not available yet that you're welcome to help us test. So the question is, how do I incorporate, now that I can register my nodes to this service, it can handle the configuration, etc. What does monitoring look like? Let's see if this node opened. Hey, here we go. Perfect. This was that node view that I was waiting to open a second ago. The timing's good because we're going to talk about monitoring. So you can go look at the properties of that node, and this is at default, it's checking in every 15 minutes. So you're in here and able to see, yep, every 15 minutes that machine checks in, it's still compliant. The commandlets do provide this information as well. So if you wanted to pull this information out and incorporate it into something else, you could. And then you can drill in and look at, yes, this is a domain controller, all the way down to the feature level. This has added the Windows feature. It's waiting for the second disk to become available to put the Active Directory database on, brings the disk online, and then provisions the domain. So I can see all the way down to the individual resource level. I can actually see at the resource level how long it took as well, if I want to get additional metadata. So this was just a check. It took 1 second for it to go in and verify that, yes, Active Directory is in a clean and healthy state. If I switch over to here, in our documentation, there's just a couple of commands that you run that would tell the Azure Automation DSC service to dump its information over to OMS, and then you can also, if you're interested, you can even collect Windows event logs, so if you want analytics and things like that coming off the individual machines. So here I could go in this case I'm saying, give me all events from all servers that you know about that are related to Microsoft Windows DSC. Just for that one server that I provisioned late last night, it's got 360 results. Most of those, if I drill into them, are going to say something like consistency check started, consistency check finished. Yeah, the timer is running. Most of these will be informational. I did set aside one additional search, so I'm just looking for event ID 4253, which is, hey, I want to see every time that DSC rebooted a node. Just give me a quick report so I can look across my entire data center and see every time that DSC automatically rebooted a node. And in this case, it's just the one time that it provisioned that machine. It was creating a domain controller, and in that process, what actually happens here is in the DSC resource, there's a variable that you can set that tells the LCM engine that it needs to handle the reboot of the node. So that thing finishes its work, and then once that configuration is finished applying, you can you notice there was that value whenever you're registering the node. Is it okay to automatically reboot? That's how that control is happening. So if you're saying yes, automatically reboot, then the configuration uses a module that requires a reboot. Then LCM logs that, and you can actually capture that and do things with it. I do have. So you can set up alerts for that as well. I set up another machine earlier and just told it, hey, if the service is pumping information to OMS and it sees a node become not compliant, I want you to tell me about it. And I've seen customers implement this into Slack channels. There's an OMS app for iOS and Android, so if you want to get prompts on your phone. But you could basically say, anytime that one of these nodes that I'm managing is not in the state that it's supposed to be, do something to let me know. It can call webhooks, it can do ITSM integration, etc. So in this case, it's that .NET Core configuration we were just looking at, and it requires a reboot, but I told the node not to automatically reboot, which means it's sitting there in a pending reboot state. And I actually have a resource that looks for pending reboots so that it would purposefully not be compliant. And in this case, this machine's coming in and saying, hey, out of all of these, the X pending resource is sitting in a not compliant state. It's a .NET Core machine named Server 2. And you've got all the information there to track down how to get access to it. In fact, yeah, up here, you can even just link over and drill in and find the quick report for all machines that are not compliant across that entire account. Let's look at a new feature. I'm going to start by looking at Server 2. Here we go. So Ben was giving me a hard time yesterday that in the pets versus cattle analogy that this leans a little bit more towards pets, but that's all right. One of the things we're looking at is for people who are new to DSC, there's a lot of information to take in. And especially whenever it gets to how do you author, that's why we're publishing more configurations and like that. There's nothing worse than just opening that editor and staring at a blank screen and saying, I don't even know where to start. So that's why we're publishing those example configurations, and we're committed to doing a better housekeeping in the future of module projects. One of the things you'll see whenever you go look at the properties of a virtual machine in Azure, if I scroll down, is this new state configuration blade. And now I can see all of the configuration details of the VM looking at just that machine. If I click on configure, I can do select composites. I think I'm running out of time. I can give it a name, and then I can do point and click authoring. So let's say in this case I want this machine to join a domain. There's 2 points I want to get into here real quickly. One is, this is just going to present a form, and you just fill out the form, you hit OK, and now you can have an integrated authoring experience for configuring a machine right there in the portal. So for people, this is really not for very experienced users of desired state configuration where they've got a defined pipeline and they've got a very mature process. This is for someone who's learning DSC for the very first time. And they don't want to even have to worry about creating the configuration scripts or the entire authoring process. They just want to get started. So they can come in here, select, these are actually composite resources, select what they want, fill out the form, we create the configuration, we wrap it, we compile it for them and assign it to the node. It ends up in the service, but everything happens behind the scenes. So they don't have to think too much about how that works. As we move this into public preview, this is in private preview right now, and I'll give you the URL so you can test it yourselves, and then we'll do Q&A. But as this moves into public preview, we also want to allow people to publish composite resources of their own into a central account and then make that available. And here's the scenario for that. Imagine that you want to take your security baseline, put it into an automation account, and then tell people in your organization, yep, you can go into Azure, you can create VMs, automation's not your thing, so just go do it from the portal. Whenever you go provision your VM, I want you to select the configuration that says security baseline. Just check the box and take care of it. I put it there, I know what it does, but I want that to be on all of our machines. And there's 100 ways that you could make that happen automatically, but that would give you the ability to empower other people in your organization to follow that best practice and always have that on their machine. So that's what we have in mind here. Let me switch back over, but I think that's it. Are we out of time? I don't know what does this go to? 3:15? Oh, we have 15 more minutes. Okay, cool. I want to show one more thing and then, are there any questions about this part of it? Yes, sir?
What's also quite an option to other DL scans, so for example, change the reboots or change the...
Yes. Yes, you can modify that. Actually, let me show you exactly how. If I switch back over, resource groups, demo 1, go look at server 2. I have a machine here that's not been onboarded to that yet. Nope, that's the wrong machine. Give me server 3. So I was saving some time there and skipping ahead. This machine has not been onboarded into this private preview yet. What happens is on this screen, you can select which OMS workspace you want it connected to, and then all of the LCM settings. So you can define if it's apply and monitor versus apply and autocorrect, reboot note if needed, what to happen after the reboot, the frequency for it to check in with the service, etc. So the URL for this, and you are more than welcome to test this out. I'll zoom in, but it's aka.ms/DSC private, I can't type, preview. And you're welcome to take a picture of that. And you're welcome to share it in your organization. If anybody is really interested in testing that capability where you can do the authoring from the portal, that's something we're interested in taking further, and we're interested in developing an API around that. So imagine that in the properties of your VM, you might be able in the future to just express your dependencies and actually even really simplify this to a very compact scenario where you could just say, like, I always want my security baseline to be linked to my VMs and things like that. So this is something that we're looking for people who are interested in research, and we can do calls and things like that. Yeah, this is great. I have a couple questions.
Is it available in all regions?
Say again?
Is it available in all regions?
I know that it's in West Central US. I'm not positive all the regions this has been provisioned to. Yes, sir. So that is also an area that we're working on right now. Now, the question was, how does this relate to Azure Policies? I don't mind talking about this. If you're interested in looking at Azure Policy, by the way, the thing I'm about to talk about, if you're also interested in looking at this in private preview, let me know. It's not really ready to demo yet and share publicly, but I don't mind just kind of talking about where we're headed. Azure Policy is available today. If you haven't seen it, it's basically the ability to say, within my subscription or at a resource group level, I want to audit what's going on. So to your example, maybe for regions, perhaps you only want storage accounts in one region. If they get deployed anywhere else, then you want to know about it or even restrict access. That's the idea of Azure Policy. What we're working on is using DSC as an engine to also be able to audit what's happening inside of machines. So you could enable this for a VM, or the way that this would actually play out is, what we think of is someone's a custodian of a cloud environment, and they're saying, I'm responsible to make sure that our organization meets regulatory policy, and we're accountable for credit card transactions, whatever the case may be. So these settings have to be there, and so then they would empower developers by saying, when you deploy your VM, it has to have policy turned on, and you can do some levels of enforcement there, and it would just check inside the machine. What it would actually do is gather a bunch of data, bring it back, and analyze it, and say, does this machine meet the regulatory requirements? The complement to that service would be to have the DSC configuration that has it meet those requirements and hand that off to the developer. So now you have the check and the balance. You have the ability to provide centralized auditing across the environment and see what's going on. But then you would also have the ability through any configuration management platform. So, obviously it could be DSC, but frankly, it could be Chef, Puppet, Ansible, whatever you want, to enable the developer to deliver the configurations that meet that baseline. So that's what we're thinking about and working on. So if anybody is interested in that, please hook up with me after we wrap up here, and it'd be great just to get your feedback on what you would like to see in that scenario as we get closer to moving it forward. So the only other thing I wanted to touch on, and this will be very brief, is here you can also see change tracking. If I go back to server 1, it's already provisioned. Actually, I think for server. So same thing, and this is generally available, so you can experiment with this right now. And we're working on the commandlets to support this as well. But under operations, you see change tracking, inventory, update management, etc. So update management is patch management as a service. Inventory is where it will reach in and take a snapshot of what's going on in the machine and just log it. And then change tracking is looking at what's the changes in that inventory information over time. This is a really cool complement to configuration management as a service. And we are looking at how we can tie these together. So if you go in here, let me scroll over. You can see across events, files, and you can actually, we have a test environment now where you can look at looking at what's happening in specific file content, like line by line changes. Registry, what software is getting installed, services. If it's a Linux machine, then it can also do daemons and things like that. And I can zoom in by time. I zoomed in too much. Let's go back to last 1 hour. And in this case, it's saying an update got installed. Oh, these are Windows services. So the orchestrator service and the WMI performance adapter, there was a change to the service. It stopped. So let's say that that was something actionable. Like that's probably just an operating system thing happening. But let's say that you identified that there was an application that someone requires and that went to a stop state. Those are all things that there are already DSC resources for. In fact, we're building out like a proof of concept module around why don't we just take the commandlets for change tracking, pull the information out. We already have a service and registry and file for as in-box DSC resources. We could automate the process of creating those resource blocks and make it very easy for someone to add that to their configuration. But these go really hand in hand. So you can think about configuration management as you're saying, this is the state that this server should be in, and it should automatically correct itself if it's not in that state. That's what I care about. And then you would use this as a complement to say, what else is happening inside this machine? Perhaps it's things that I never even thought that I should manage or monitor, but tell me about unmanaged drift happening inside that machine, and then use them as a complement to each other. And this obviously goes really well with those other capabilities where you can also do inventory and then patch management as a service and building that into your application from day one. So I think that's it for all we have time for. So tomorrow morning, the other session around DSC, I'm actually going to demo the new LCM engine. And I think that's, if you're interested in DSC, that's a really fun one to look at. It's got a REST interface and all kinds of cool stuff. So if there's any questions, I'll stick around. And thank you very much for attending the session. I appreciate it.